Welcome to another United States history lecture. This one is on early American Indian policy. We will be looking at target 2.06 in your target sheet. One of the key things that we have to understand about early American Indian policy is that it was the job of the federal government, the national government, to relate to deal with Indians. That's because Native peoples were seen as like a foreign country. They were not seen as American citizens, part of the United States. To get new lands would require meeting with them and getting them to sign treaties, just like you would get a treaty with another country. So Indian policy was not done by the early American states. It was done by the federal government. So that's the first thing that you need to realize. The second thing is the federal government decided that the most important thing that they could do besides get land from Indians would be to get Native peoples to copy white culture. And specifically, they wanted American Indians to farm. There was a belief that American Indians who became farmers would then become more like white Americans. They would see property as something that you could individually own. They would adopt American culture. And ultimately, it would improve relations with Native peoples. Thomas Jefferson actually went so far as to say it would make it easier for Americans to buy land from Native peoples. When you try to get someone to act like you, to behave like you, to adopt your culture, that is called assimilation. It's the word at the top of the slide. Assimilation, you can see that that word in the middle has S-I-M-I-L, which is the same as the word similar. And that's what it essentially comes from. This idea that you would have two people become similar to each other. How do you make Indians become similar to Americans? How do you make them assimilate? Give them plows. If they're going to learn to be a farmer, then they need to have the actual farming implement. Not all Indians were excited about this possibility of becoming like white Americans, because it would involve giving up aspects of their culture. And even though they might have enjoyed getting plows or getting farm equipment from Americans, they did not want to lose what made them Indian peoples. So many Indians would welcome these presents from Americans, these gifts of plows and seeds and farming instruments. But welcoming a gift doesn't necessarily mean that you appreciate the gift like the person who gave it to you does. And you guys have experienced that before, when you've been given something and then you use it or enjoy it in a way that's different than the person intended for you. So many Native peoples only outwardly changed their behaviors. So they took the plows and they learned to plow, learned to farm, but that was only an outward change in their lives. Inwardly, they were still Indians and they kept their Indian values. Taking a plow and learning how to grow wheat doesn't turn you into an American. It just makes you an Indian who knows how to plow and grow wheat. And you still see the world through your Indian values, your traditions, your history, and your culture. We call this accommodation. Accommodation means to bring in a part of someone's culture or expectations for you, but not fundamentally change who you are. To accommodate means to make it easy for you to take on this other culture without changing who you are on the inside. Here's a famous painting of Indians being given gifts. The white man in the painting, with those really fancy blue socks, is a Benjamin Hawkins. He is a North Carolina citizen who goes on to work with the Creek Indians who live in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, but mostly Georgia and Alabama. These Indians, you can see, are getting a plow. They've got over here a spade, a shovel that you can dig with. You see another plow and a wagon. You see houses being built. The message here is that these people are becoming more like Benjamin Hawkins, and they're producing quite a bit of white people food as a result. Look at all this corn they're growing. Rutabagas, huge, giant turnips and rutabagas, and maybe potatoes here. I don't know if that's exactly what that is. So the message of the painting is that he is bringing to them the elements of civilization. And you notice how important he is, how much lighter he is, how central he is in the painting because of his height. He's taller than they are. So clearly, the artist who made this wanted to portray Hawkins as bringing good, wonderful, civilizing gifts to these Creek people. Much of the United States government's plan for assimilating Indians was based on a belief that it would help with frontier expansion. You can see from the map here that by 1790, there are people starting to show up in Ohio. This is Ohio right here on the map. You can see that they are expanding far into Kentucky. They're even getting close to the Mississippi River. And they're not always nice people. They're not always kind people. In fact, most of them aren't. Therefore, they are coming into conflict with Native peoples. So the United States government felt that if they could civilize, quote unquote, the Native folks in the West, it would reduce this conflict. And it would allow these lands to be open to white settlement. The second map shows you the movement of those folks as they're going west. You can see between 1790 and 1800, large portions of Ohio are becoming more settled than they were before. Spotty settlements extending all the way out towards Illinois, Louisiana, places that are going to have lots and lots of native peoples. And the government's hope is if those native peoples become farmers, they will embrace and welcome these new settlers. Or invaders might be a better term for them from the perspective of the next person I'm about to talk about. Because white settlers were aggressive in their taking of Indian lands, showing up uninvited, unannounced in the Western territories. Many Indians were not eager to have them as neighbors. Even if the federal government gave them plows and gifts, they did not want these aggressive people living nearby. And native peoples who were angry over the invasions saw that it would be possible to not assimilate, not accommodate, but actually resist. Two examples of this resistance occurred between 1783 and 1795, where Indians in Ohio blocked the expansion of the United States by twice defeating federal armies. Twice they won in battle against the US government. But in 1795, the man pictured on the right, General Mad Anthony Wayne, defeated these Ohio Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, signaling that the federal government was going to give you plows, encourage you to civilize, but if you didn't accept this march of people coming to the West, they would also then use force to take you down. And I think that's an important point here to think about. The United States government policy might have seemed really nice when it was assimilation, but the assimilation always came with the assumption that white people were going to be moving west. And if Indians did not want that, then the US government was prepared to actually beat these Indians in battle and take their land from them. As a result of Mad Anthony Wayne's defeat of these Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Native people signed the Treaty of Greenville. The Native peoples in Ohio gave up 2/3 of the state of Ohio in this treaty. And they did that in exchange for yearly supplies and a cash payment of $20,000. So every year they were supposed to be given wagon loads of food and other things that they valued as a result of signing the Treaty of Greenville. So even with resistance, the federal government was determined to stop Native peoples from blocking westward expansion. Violence was always going to be the United States government's last tool, if sometimes not its first tool, so that they could get control of Western lands. We can see here a map showing the 2/3 of Ohio that's taken in the Treaty of Greenville. Fallen Timbers is up here close to the Maumee River near Toledo. You might be thinking, why is it called Fallen Timbers? There was a tornado that blew through the area the year before the battle, so lots of damaged trees were in the area. So fallen timber. The lands that were taken under the Greenville Treaty would include Columbus. You can see would be roughly right about here in the middle of the state. Here is a picture painted, a painting made of the signing of the Treaty of Greenville. And you notice that white folks are at the center of the painting. They're the direct center of the painting. These Native peoples are negotiating and deciding how they want to be compensated for giving up this land. Our last example of resistance is a Native leader that you may have heard of because he's quite famous in Ohio history. His name is Tecumseh. In fact, there is an outdoor theatrical production that is made to tell his story that you can see here in Ohio. Tecumseh was a Shawnee Indian, and he decided to organize not just Shawnee peoples, but lots of other folks who were not part of his nation to fight U.S. culture and to resist U.S. settlers. So he created a confederacy of Western Indians, a grouping of all of these peoples in Ohio and Indiana to fight against Americans who kept on moving and moving west and taking Indian territory. Tecumseh's brother was TenSup, which is quite a name to spell. So on a test, just get as close as you can. TenSup was quite a drinker, and he got so blackout drunk at one point that his folks thought he was dead. His people thought he had died. He woke up from this and said that he had had a vision, and the vision was alcohol is bad. Not a surprise there, if you've been blackout drunk, which I'm assuming none of you have because you're all underage. This started a religious movement of rejecting white culture. Alcohol was a symbol of white culture, and a particularly potent symbol of white culture, given what it did to Native peoples. So TenSup called for Native peoples to return to traditional Indian values, to embrace Indian and Native ways, and to say no to white culture and especially alcohol. Tecumseh reached out and worked with the British in Canada to block American expansion, because Indians, as we've talked about before, have been dependent for a number of years on American goods, particularly American guns. And without the ability to make those themselves, they're going to need a source for that. So in the South, closer to New Orleans, you could try to reach out to the Spanish to get access. Closer to Canada, you would reach across the border to the British. And so Tecumseh allied himself with British people just as America was on the verge of a war with England in 1812. When that war broke out, it made Tecumseh not just the enemy of westward expansion, but also the enemy of Americans, since he was allied with the British. He tried to get all the Indians, both North and South, to join him in his fight with British help against Americans, but he failed to get all of the Western natives to join his cause. And he actually died in 1813 in battle with his British allies at the Battle of the Thames. So that ended his move to try to block U.S. expansion. His brother TenSup was also defeated in battle, but not killed. And pretty much at this point, the move to stop Americans from expanding west falls apart for Native peoples. So as we've looked at in this lecture here, Native peoples have three options for, dealing with westward expansion of Americans and American culture. They can assimilate and just become white and adopt white culture and American culture. They can accommodate, borrow what they like, but remain Indian, or they can resist. In the end, I think the sad story is no matter which path they choose, they lose aspects of their Indianness because of the greed and aggressive desire of Americans for Western land. Here is Tecumseh on the left, looking pretty not so much Indian. If you didn't know that was Tecumseh, you just might think he was maybe an American who had his portrait made. This is his brother Tenskwatawa, looking more culturally Indian with wearing of these metal pieces, pierced ears, the way he's wearing the sashes around his headgear, for example. And here's a map showing the relentless expansion of Americans west as they take 2/3 of Ohio, and then they take more after the defeat of Tecumseh and his allies. Um, as expansion goes forward, all of this land will eventually come under the control of Americans. And it will set us up for a future lecture, and we look at how Americans dealt with all of these native peoples that you see on this map: Potawatomis, Miamis, Kickapoos, Sauk, Fox, etc. So that will be a future story that we will look at where these native peoples end up going.